Welcome to the behind the scenes for episode 125, Mysterious Dwarves and Where to Find Them. Because this is such a unique entry into the Dwarf series, this behind the scenes is also going to be a bit different from what you're used to seeing. If you haven't seen any of the previous Dwarf videos, you can go ahead and click on this link to be taken to a playlist that will play every Dwarf video and their accompanying behind the scenes in the correct order that you're supposed to see them. Now, this is going to be a rather complicated episode to explain, so there's a couple things that I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with before we proceed. So the first thing that I want to make sure is clear is that unlike the previous Dwarf videos, which have all been meticulously planned from beginning to end, this one actually started out as a normal video, and it evolved into a Dwarf video over time. So the actual quest was completely unscripted. That was a prank that they came up with that I had no knowledge of. So everything that you see basically from the beginning of the video all the way up until the point where I arrived at the Mushroom Island is literally just my authentic reaction to the prank. And everything after that point, from when I leave the Mushroom Island all the way up until the end of the video, is something that I specifically scripted in order to help this to fit within the Dwarf series. And of course there's also some extra stuff, such as the songs that were sung by example, but I'm going to come back to those later. Now, the primary purpose of this behind the scenes is to allow me to explain both the series of events and the thought process that turned this from just a normal reaction to their prank into an actual Dwarf video. So I want to begin by explaining what motivated their prank. I know in the video it looks very much like Paul was the mastermind because he was the one who signed all the books, but it was actually Kashi who sort of set everything into motion. This all goes back to the Trump prank from a couple months ago. Chronologically speaking, they actually performed the castle prank just over a week after the Trump video went up. That's actually why they were referencing it with the whole Donald Trump duck joke, because my video was still very fresh in their minds while they were performing the prank. Now, the Trump video was uploaded on February 11th, but I actually recorded the prank portion of that video all the way back in mid-January. It took me almost a full month to edit that video because the extra 18 hours worth of footage I brought on from Third Echelon AFK's point of view really bogged down my editing program to the point where it would freeze for a full 5 minutes after every single button click. Now, something that you guys didn't get to see in the Trump video was that we actually had a bit of a false start when we tried to generate the time-lapse of the campaign poster being built. During our first attempt, Kashi was actually there helping us, but originally I had tried to record it instead of streaming it and downloading the footage later, and my hard drive filled up almost immediately. So we basically decided to reset and come back to it the next day. During the second attempt, which is the one that you guys saw in the video, Kashi was busy most of that day, so he wasn't able to help us until about 5 minutes after Paul and I had already finished the whole thing. So because he didn't get to fulfill that desire of being a part of the prank, that's actually what drove him to want to perform a prank of his own. Now, Kashi loves pranking, but all the ideas that he's come up with in the past have verged on griefing. So this time he went to Example for help, and it was actually Example who pitched the idea for the castle. Unfortunately, Example wasn't available to take part in the prank, so Kashi took the idea to Paul and Joe instead. And they included Pecos to help write that book because he's the one responsible for writing most of the server's lore. So since I was basically stuck in editing hell and therefore unable to play for a month straight, they had free roam of the server, giving them all the time that they needed to coordinate with each other and gather resources. Now, we actually recorded the ending to the Trump video just moments before I uploaded it on February 11th. So that's why I'm still wearing the Border Patrol skin in the opening to episode 125. Because that shot was recorded right between the Trump video going up and the castle prank being performed. Now, originally, I wasn't even planning on using that footage at all. It just happened to be in the same comp that I recorded the rest of the video in, but we're going to address why I decided to keep it later. So, now that that's out of the way, I want to take a moment to explain to you guys why I felt it was necessary to basically hijack their story and turn this into a Dwarf video. My main concern from the beginning was that although I tend to drift in and out of the fourth wall pretty regularly on this channel, the Dwarf videos are intended to be taken seriously. Now, obviously they had planned this prank as though it had involved the Dwarf. They intentionally put that gold block right at the turn-off to the end portal, just like how I found the gold in episode 100. But because the prank was being performed on me, and therefore I wasn't available to help them with things, such as summoning non-despawning gold blocks in item form, they went for the simpler method of just placing the gold blocks instead. And that was kind of a problem, because it really blurred the line between what we'd established in the previous Dwarf videos and what we were seeing as I experienced the prank. So these conflicting details, and the fact that Paul had signed all the books, made me really worried that my audience was going to be confused as to whether or not this is supposed to be considered a part of the Dwarf canon. So at some point, I was going to need to draw a definitive line between the simulated Dwarf activity for their prank and the actual Dwarf activity for the storyline. And I figured that the best way to accomplish that would be to incorporate the real Dwarf into the video. But before I could move forward, I was going to need to edit down the footage that I had so that I could get a feel for the direction the video was headed in. And my primary concern at that point were the hours of footage I had of me trying to navigate my way around the Mushroom Island. All that stuff about me getting lost and ending up back at Paul's base, that actually happened during the original recording. But the footage that I had wasn't going to be easily edited, and I just wasn't sure how I was going to convey that part of the story in a way that was interesting and wouldn't eat up a ton of time. Now, you might remember a while ago that Example made a song about Kashi the Viking. Well, he had expressed interest to me about making more of those songs, so that, plus the necessity to find a way to demonstrate what happened on the way to the Mushroom Island, is basically what got me to come up with the idea for the song. I went to Example with the Brave Sir Robin clip from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and I gave him some line about how cowardly Seiferus doesn't play by the rules, and Example whipped out that song, like, way faster than I was ready for it. Now, the problem with the original version of the song he sent me, which I had him upload on his channel so that you guys could hear it, because it's actually my favorite version of the song, is that it combined the brave portion of the Sir Robin bit and the cowardly portion into the same song. So I was going to need to generate some new lyrics in order to split it into two different songs. But nonetheless, armed with the prototype of the song and a nugget of an idea on how to demonstrate the trip to the Mushroom Island, I was able to move forward with editing the video. Now, this is where things got kind of nuts. Remember how I said that I originally wasn't planning on using that clip with Kashi at spawn? Well, since it was at the beginning of my comp, I was going to need to render it out and send it to Kashi before I could move on with the rest of the video. But that's when I realized that Kashi was dressed up as Belle from Beauty and the Beast. It turns out that while they were performing the prank, Kashi, Paul, Joe, and Pecos were all dressed up as Disney characters. So when I noticed Kashi's skin, I jotted down some lyric about how Kashi was wearing a dress, now everything starts to make sense, and that made me keep the clip in my comp just long enough to notice that once I dropped in the background music, having that extra clip at the beginning allowed the song to sync up stunningly well with the moment where I realized that the gold blocks are part of the prank. And that right there is where this video really took off. I decided that the music was going to be what directed my editing, and I'm really glad that I did because pretty much every step of the way, the footage just seemed to sync up to the music almost effortlessly. So as I moved forward with the editing and I refamiliarized myself with the footage, I noticed that there was an absolute ton of details that really conveniently lent this to becoming a dwarf video. First of all, the church was on fire. That was a freak accident that they had nothing to do with. I can only assume that what happened is that since they had spent so much time at my base, there must have been a lightning storm that struck the back of the church and the fire just spread without them noticing. I really don't know what caused it, but it was such an odd occurrence that I was definitely going to need to address it once I got back to the castle. So I figured I might as well just incorporate it into how I included the dwarf, and the fact that it was a church was also pretty convenient, considering not only was the first dwarf video titled All Hail the Dwarf Lord, but that future dwarf video that I brought up in episode 101 happens to take place in a cathedral. So this video being in between is a great way to set that one up. Now, the next part of the editing that made it really convenient was the book that Pecos wrote about mysterious dwarves and where to find them. That book was 26 pages long, and adding those clips from the previous dwarf videos not only helped me to cut out almost half of those pages, but the visuals also really complemented a lot of what Pecos wrote. And there's also that chest in the hedge maze that turned out to be empty. Now, obviously that was just a mistake on their part, but if you think about it, it actually kind of helps to set up the idea that Humphrey was there. Because there were emeralds in the chest on the other side, so maybe at one point there was supposed to be gold in this one, but Humphrey came and took it. I mean, when we looked in Example's vault in episode 100, we established that Humphrey had only taken the gold and that he left the diamonds and emeralds untouched. So doesn't it kind of make sense that he would take the gold from this chest, but leave the diamonds in the chest in the bedroom and the emeralds in the chest in the courtyard? Now, there was also diamonds in the chest with the chorus plant and the ender eye, but those end-related items are going to be even more important. I don't want to give too much away, but they sort of set up a future direction that we have planned for the dwarf series. Now, after that was the Rapunzel clue, and the cut hair in the chest is what gave me the idea to shear the sheep later. So as you can see, even before I left for the Nether, there were quite a few details that really nicely set things up for Humphrey's appearance later. Now, speaking of the Nether, in the original recording, that trip was almost as boring as the one to the Mushroom Island. So the purpose of adding the songs was to try to keep the tone a little bit more lively and energetic. While I was originally editing this portion of the video, I was just using the prototype version of the song, and eventually I decided that the only version I should change was the one where Example sung about me crafting a boat, since at this point you guys wouldn't have seen that part yet. Now, I cannot stress enough how difficult it was to generate that footage of me going through the Nether. That probably took more time than anything else in the entire video. I had to bind my movement to the caps lock key and record with 3rd Echelon AFK while I was dancing around with Seiferus and trying to sync up the movements of the song and staying in frame. It took absolutely forever. In the end, I opted not to use the lyric about Kashi being in a dress, and instead decided just to interject into example singing with that little bit where I asked about the church being on fire. I chose to do this not only because it's funnier, but because it also reminds the audience about the church and prepares them that it's something we're going to have to come back to later. So once I got through Paul's portal, I went through the land of darkness and made it up to what I called the land of peaceful tranquility. Something Paul pointed out to me later was that he actually placed rose bushes all along the edge of the root forest as a sort of a border between the good and evil lands, acting as basically a barrier to keep the darkness from spreading. We probably won't draw too much attention to it in our videos, but the concept has been sort of incorporated into the server's lore. So when you watch our videos and you see rose bushes that seem to be placed very specifically, you might enjoy knowing that there is a bit more of an esoteric meaning behind it. Now, the closer I got to the end of the prank, the more I was thinking about the dwarf and how I was going to need to incorporate him into the video. He was on my mind so much that it started to affect how I perceived the prank. When I first got into the catacombs, I made that remark about the door sound because for a moment I thought I actually heard the sound that we use for Humphrey's armored footsteps, and it legitimately freaked me out. Now, obviously I knew that there was no possible way that that could have been the case, so I decided it was probably best if I just tried to put Humphrey out of my mind entirely and focus solely on the prank until it was done. Now, if you look closely at the point where I got to the boss fight, you can actually see that there was supposed to be a second mob coming up over on the right. Paul told me that it was supposed to be a skeleton, but I guess there was some sort of bug at the time that allowed named skeletons to despawn. Honestly, things probably would have turned out very differently for me if I had had to fight a skeleton in there as well, so I'm not complaining. Once I got out of the mansion with the princess, the gears were really starting to turn in my head. Take a look at this clip from the original recording that I ended up cutting from the final video. It would have been even more amazing if they had actually, because my wife, is a member of the server. She just doesn't play that often. If they had actually had her avatar waiting there, got her in on it, that would have just been insane. As you can clearly see, these thoughts laid the foundation for how things eventually went. Shortly after that point is where I got out of the forest and I saw the gold blocks again, which prompted the question, what does any of this have to do with dwarves? I brought this up to Paul, and he said that the idea was that the dwarf had kidnapped the princess and locked her in the catacombs, but he left her to be guarded by his minions. And again, this prompted me to feel like I had to include the dwarf, since we didn't actually see him in the video. But at the same time, this was a bit of a relief, because it would have been a nightmare if they had tried to put a mob representation of Humphrey in there instead. That could have completely bastardized everything that we have worked towards so far. Anyway, I couldn't go down to the land of darkness because I couldn't get the sheep through the portion with the ladders easily, so that's what got me thinking of heading to Alamantis' base instead. Once I got back out of the tree and I saw the gold blocks again, I started to make the connection about the golden fleece. And it turns out, Paul didn't even plan that. He told me that once he got the sheep into the catacombs, he just thought that white was too plain of a color and it didn't differentiate the sheep from the ones outside, so he just grabbed a random flower to make dye, meaning that it was a complete coincidence that the sheep ended up looking the same color as the gold blocks. I was a little bit surprised that they didn't make her purple like the sheep statue that they had torn down, but I'm really glad that they went with yellow because it makes all the difference in how the storyline is going to play out. Now, the reason I thought to head to Alamantis' base was because I had remembered that Paul's base was located on the same continent. But when I looked it up on the website, I realized that it was actually Paul's current base that I was thinking of that was somewhat close by, and his old base, the one that we were at, was actually twice as far. So that's what got me thinking about heading to the Mushroom Island instead. Now, as I sort of just stated, in the original recording, I plotted out my course using the map on the 3rd Echelon website. But it was a little hard to follow, and I felt like I was pulling you too much out of the story by going from Minecraft in full screen into a windowed web browser. So for the final version of the video, I decided to polish it up by generating the map graphic in order to clearly demonstrate the location of things and their relation to each other. And since I was going to all the trouble to generate the graphic anyway, I decided to also utilize it to demonstrate what happened on my way to the Mushroom Island during Example's second song. This whole part was really tricky to put together because in order to convey what was happening clearly, it was going to require some very specifically timed visuals in combination with Example's lyrics and my own verbal cues. I knew that in order to get the look that I wanted, I was going to need to animate the chunks rendering in one chunk at a time, frame by frame, so it was going to be a minimum of a week's worth of work. And being that I personally don't have a solid understanding of what goes into constructing music, I felt more comfortable just giving Example the general idea of what I wanted and having him generate the music beforehand so that I could then generate the graphics to his song. But unfortunately, he also felt that it would be easier for him if he was able to construct the song based off visuals that I provided. So we both wanted the other person to go first. That made things pretty difficult, and in the end, I just decided that because it works so well with the Dance Through the Nether, I might as well just use the prototype version of the song again and generate the visuals based on that, writing the new lyrics as I went along. Now, in order to explain what happened during the trip to the Mushroom Island, there were a couple of points I was definitely going to need to hit before we got to the portion of the song where Example sang about me crafting the boat. Since the tempo was different during that particular verse, I couldn't move it around to another section very easily and keep the song feeling balanced. So I thought it was best if I just tried to keep it where it was and work my visuals around that, using it as an anchor. After the animation begins, I felt that it was important that the first thing that I showed was the path straight to the point I had circled while we were plotting out the course in order to find out if those chunks were going to render in as land or as water. Fortunately, I was actually able to use the footage from my original recording for this part, which was fantastic because when we cut from the map view to the game footage, you can actually see the chunks freshly generating in. Moving forward, in order to further demonstrate my struggle to find an opening to get to the Mushroom Island, there were a couple of different spots that I could choose from for the next clip in the montage. I chose this spot, which was rotated in the final version of the video, because like before, it allowed me to use the actual footage I had from the original recording. And the decision to include the polar bear was entirely based on the fact that the lyric fit nicely with the setting. The next spot was special because it's actually not there on the server. In reality, that part opened up into a much more complicated body of water, but I decided to simplify things for the joke because in the original recording, the path I took was a lot more chaotic and harder to demonstrate. Now, as I said before, recording these shots was insanely difficult, and you might notice that with this one, my name tag looks a little bit weird. That's because it's actually upside down and backwards. I originally recorded it this way, but it was disorienting for us to be entering the cove from above and then switching the camera around. So I tried several times to re-record this the proper way, but I never got anything that I liked better than this one, so I just flipped it around. After this part, rather than tell what happened when I got back to Paul's base with new lyrics, I decided just to cut the lyrics entirely and talk over the music instead. Once I left again from Paul's base, I went straight to the point we had circled previously and just took the sheep over the land. This gave me the opportunity to do a little bit more animation, and since the flip into the boat was so much fun to animate the first time, I decided just to include it here again. Now, while we're on the subject of animation, I want to point out that the way you row a boat in Minecraft is actually all wrong. I chose to animate it the proper way, where your back is facing the direction you're going, because it's physically impossible to row a boat the way that you do it in Minecraft without using a special setup that's specifically engineered to let you row the direction that you're facing. Anyway, from here I chose to show the reveal of the Trump poster because it's located right next to the Mushroom Island. There was a little bit of an error in the translation with the lyrics here. I'm not sure if the idiom that I use is common saying in New Zealand, but the lyrics I sent originally said, "Princess, just hang tight," instead of "Princess, hang on tight." Obviously, with the visuals I had planned, just hang tight makes more sense, since I'm leaving her in the boat to go scope things out, but it really wasn't worth taking the time to change. So after this I get to the Mushroom Island, and that ends the mostly unscripted portion of the recording. Before we move on to the dwarf portion of the behind the scenes, there are a few bits of extra information that I wanted to share with you guys. First of all, the reason that I didn't have my items with me at the beginning of the prank was because I had this little project going where I made a backup of the chunks around the winery at my vineyard, and then I invited Paul and Joe to come over in creative mode to rebuild it. The idea was that I would replace the chunks later with the backup and then take from their ideas in order to improve my own version in survival. This event took place right before they performed the prank, so it was sort of out of my control to fix things before I hopped on. In the original recording, I had to go over there to get my items, but explaining the whole creative mode swapping chunks thing just sort of overcomplicated things, so I ended up cutting almost anything to do with the vineyard from the final video. Earlier we talked about the book in the library that Pecos wrote. The title was obviously a reference to J.K. Rowling's book, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, which is a guide to the magical creatures from the Harry Potter universe. Just as J.K. Rowling chose to use a pseudonym to purport the idea that her book was actually written as a textbook by the fictitious author Newt Scamander, Pecos also presents the book as though it's a field guide written by Dr. Kost. So you might be wondering, who is Dr. Kost? Well, they had intended it to be a pseudonym for Koala Steamed. And I'd also like to note that since I did end up cutting almost half the pages from that book, if you're interested, you can read the full text of that book in the description of this video. Now, for those of you with keen eyes, you're probably curious about that arm movement that I made when I was throwing those tantrums during the songs. I accomplished that with a resource pack by aiming an invisible bow in the air and then looking down immediately as I let go of the arrow. Alright, so let's go ahead and move on to how I incorporated the dwarf. Normally when I make a dwarf video, I've got a lot more time to devote to it. I usually get to plan things out and spend months putting these shots together. This time around I didn't have that luxury, so I decided that instead of drawing direct attention to the dwarf, I should try to focus on building up the atmosphere. And there were two things that I knew I wanted right off the bat. I wanted to include the church by having everybody locked in there, and I wanted to have the sheep turn out to actually be my wife's character. But because of how many different schedules I was going to need to work around, I figured it was best if I tried to simplify things. So I decided the easiest way to accomplish what I wanted would be to have only one person in the church and have everybody else die before I got through the door. So since my wife had a bigger role in the ending and we were able to record everybody else's audio separate, Paul just gave me his login info so that we were able to record while he was at school. Now, unlike the previous behind the scenes, the command block setup for this video ended up getting pretty messy, so I'm going to go ahead and simplify things a bit. When I first got back to the base, we see a message that Pecos burned to death. That was accomplished using a simple tell raw command, and if you're really paying attention at this point, you'll actually notice that the fire in the church has gotten much worse than when we left it. Next was a shot in the tower where the Rapunzel clue was, and it's actually kind of funny that I brought her up there, because it would have required me to bring her up this ladder, and I literally sailed for hours just to avoid taking her down the ladder to the Land of Darkness, but thanks to the magic of editing, that wasn't an issue. So the way that I achieved this shot was to have my wife in spectator mode, spectating inside of the sheep. And then when I sheared it, I had her use a command to place a redstone block that activated another series of command blocks that make the sheep invisible, generate that particle cloud, and set my wife into survival mode so that she would become visible to us. After a long delay, it also activates the tell raw command to say that Kashi went up in flames. And just to clarify, the difference between burn to death and went up in flames is dependent on whether or not you're standing in the fire when you die. If you die from fire damage but you aren't standing in the fire, it'll say that you burned to death. But if you die from fire damage while you're in the middle of it, then it'll say that you went up in flames. So anyway, I made sure to have my wife direct me to the church in order to help establish what was going on. The next shot was the big one. This was the setup that I used in the beginning of the recording to set things into motion. When I ran over this pressure plate, it sets off a series of repeaters to first activate Joe's death message and then teleport my wife's character over to this spot. There's a button right on the block in front of her that she needs to hit in order to set off the next chain of events. Now, there's something interesting you probably didn't notice about the door and why I had such a hard time opening it. These doors are intended to open outward. We actually had a second door on the inside in this position in order to simulate the door opening inward. When my wife pressed that next button, it would activate another series of command blocks that would remove the main door, revealing the secondary door to make it look like I had been able to get it open. While this is going on, it also activated a couple of particle commands to temporarily obstruct my view as I entered the church. Inside the church itself, there were already a bunch of particle commands being activated on repeat in order to give it that smoky, fiery atmosphere. Most of the command blocks in these chains were meant to just use the set block command to add more fire to the church in order to make it look like the fire was spreading. This one teleports my wife to the spot she's going to need to be in for the next part of the recording, and this one kills Paul so that he dies before I can save him. He dies using the kill command, so I'll come back to this in a minute as to how we got it to say that he burned to death instead of fell out of the world. These ones over here cause the smoke to get much worse in that area, forcing me to retreat back to the door. The way I had my wife trigger the next set of commands was to have her hit respawn on the computer that was logged in as Paul. That caused him to respawn on a pressure plate that activates another series of command blocks, which teleports my wife's character back out of the doorway a couple blocks, while also replacing the door again to give the illusion that the door has been closed. From there I had my wife jump off the bridge and run back underneath it to hit this pressure plate in order to activate these command blocks. This one teleports her away so that there wouldn't be any chance that I would accidentally see her name tag again, and these two summon the items for the golden fleece and the cyan flower. The flower is a reference to episode 58, where I gave it to her as a gift. You may have also noticed earlier that I modified her skin to have the flower in her hair. As you can imagine, this flower here, which was originally from the Pocket Edition, is actually just a retextured dead bush. And Paul's death message was accomplished by changing the language portion of the resource pack from saying fell out of the world to burn to death. Now, I was still working on episode 125 when I took part in the UHC, so I accidentally started it with my resource pack on. Luckily, we spawned in right next to a desert, so I noticed the dead bush looking like cyan flowers right away, but something that I didn't notice until I was editing was that it had said that Kashi had burned to death when Lanky was giving him a wedgie at the beginning. It's perfectly timed, but what actually happened was that right as Lanky was attacking, Tad used the kill command on Kashi to reset his health before the UHC started. Luckily, because of the way I had set up the video, I was able to cover up the inaccurate death message by using an angle that was recorded by Durandal. Anyway, in order to keep the video from getting too much longer, I needed to die once I jumped off the bridge so that I wouldn't be able to keep chasing after Humphrey. So at the end of the command block chain that was set off when Paul respawned, there was a specific command in there to replace my elytra with a broken pair. I wasn't planning to even try to activate the elytra when I jumped, but I took that extra precaution just in case my elytra showed up in the death screen, which they actually did, so it was totally worth it. Now, because this was such a complicated sequence to record, This entire chunk of command blocks here was literally designed just as a way to quickly reset everything so that we could start over if we made a mistake. So there's a command block in there to put the door back, some to reset the fire, there's commands to simulate the guts of the other players, and a whole series of command blocks just to reset my inventory back to exactly what I had at the beginning of the shot. Now, as far as the actual dwarf, as I said before, I had planned to minimize his involvement and instead work more on the atmosphere. In fact, I had originally planned to have the dwarf just grab Julie from behind, but because of how little negative space there was around her in the doorway, I didn't think it was going to be easy for you to make out what was happening, so I had to put him inside the church instead. I'm not exactly sure why he would just be hanging out in the church while it's burning down, but I guess the details aren't all that important. Anyway, after every dwarf video since episode 75, we've sort of been stringing you guys along with the whole dragon fight. Now the issue is, it takes an absurd amount of time to make these dwarf videos happen, so by the time I'm done, I kind of have to take a break from Minecraft in order to get caught up with all the other work that I have for my other projects. So I just can't devote the proper amount of time necessary to set everything up for the dragon fight. So what inevitably happens is that I end up coming back onto my channel with a normal style video and we almost just sort of pretend that nothing happened. I mean, we've avoided going to the end, but other than that, nothing's really changed. This time, however, because it involves my wife being held hostage, it sort of injects a certain amount of urgency into things, meaning that I can't just continue to kick the can down the road. So as soon as I'm done with these other projects that I need to finish, I'm going to need to come back here and figure out how to rescue the princess and wrap up this arc of the dwarf storyline. Hopefully it doesn't take too long, because I really don't want to have another situation like we did with episode 100, where the New Year's and base progression videos got shoved so far off of their scheduling. Anyway, that's it for now. I hope you guys enjoyed their prank, as well as this behind the scenes. Take it easy, and I'll see you next time.